We've got Rich Braun here from Splunk. He's going to be talking about 2 years of fun and productivity on the DockerHub. He is a DevOps engineer who helped launch the cloud managed hosting service and has spent the last 2 years creating developer productivity tools. Fun fact about Rich is that he's been on the being acquired side of a few acquisitions and has just recently been on the opposing side of that and trying to make it a good experience for all around. So I'm sure you did a great job having gone through that yourself. Do we have your mic on? Are you good to go?
Testing.
I think we got you. All right, Rich, over to you.
Hey, good morning. I'm the one between you and lunch, so I will try to be concise. But I am not known for concise. I'm an engineer and not a marketer. So I wanted to share my journey here. Do any of you run Docker or Kubernetes on home machines other than your laptop at home? Just give a show of hands. Anybody? Anybody? Anybody build a robot like what we just saw? That was really cool. Unfortunately, I can't compete with that. But I'm inspired now. I have a T-shirt from my old embedded systems days where my career started. So first I'll share who am I, and then I'll tell you what we're actually looking at on the screen here. I am a longtime electrical engineer, came in to the field from the hardware side, used to build gadgets and gizmos, some of which you'll see flying, or not always flying, on Boeing jets that have been in the news lately. Moved here from Boston 7 years ago. It's been a wild ride. I've only had 2 employers since I moved. First, I built the store-to-cloud service, and then I joined Splunk the next year, and I've been with Splunk ever since. At work, we probably manage about 100,000 Docker nodes. We eat petabytes for breakfast, but I have 5 Docker nodes at home. I can be reached as my online handle is Instant Linux, wherever you find people. I also wanted to share that I live a little bit dangerously. And I tap on the wrong button sometimes. That I bicycle through the neighborhoods across the street from here to get to work. I wanted to recognize Tess Rothstein, who lost her life in an unfortunate accident. So a lot of what we do in the online world, we have to go through the real world in order to get to where we work. So I've been following a Massachusetts bill that one of my old friends who's in the state Senate is working on to make the streets safer for bicyclists. There was action just last Thursday on that. So my talk is really about my journey as a cloud engineer, that I wanted to ask this question that a lot more people are starting to ask now. What would it take to secede from the internet? What if I'm not happy with what Facebook does with my data, with what Google does with the back-end systems? I don't need to name companies. They're just large companies. They're housed in big towers like that. And the alternatives that are available here in the DockerHub community are quite remarkable. So I wanted to share my journey, first of using some of those tools, and then of starting down the journey of adding new ones. Maybe robots someday. A little word about what we're looking at here. Why do I have the back end of a PowerPoint thing showing up on the screen? This is actually running and served from my home service at the moment. I have the domain name ci.net. Yes, I'm old. There were 2-letter domains available when I first got online. But it also meant that I can take a tool that looks kind of like Google Docs. It's called OpenX App Suite, and run it on that home system, and it's served up directly from my house here in San Francisco. Where did all this start? I used to have an email server that worked about like Hillary's way back in the day. And in 2008, a fellow somewhere in France came up with something called LXC. And when I joined Splunk, I decided to build a pipeline, a Jenkins pipeline, using LXC. But we got vendor locked into AWS for about 4 years. There was an opportunity to switch teams, so I embarked on something new. I wanted to learn a new technology, a new career skill. At that point, Docker was 3 years old, and I decided, hey, why don't I take my home systems and migrate them off of LXC? And the motivation is, hey, I work in cloud. I know not to trust the cloud. I'm sure that some of you feel that way too. So off to the computer store, which is actually literally half a block from where we're sitting now, Central Computers. I also knew that if our cloud bill at work was in the 8 figures at the time, 9 figures today, I don't want to incur that kind of cost at home. Even Google is fairly pricey. So here's my little setup. It looks like a box that I went out and picked up at the Central Computer Store. It's got a main board and RAM that I ordered from Newegg online. And actually, the terabyte SSD turned out to be kind of overkill. But really, with Docker, the main constraint is RAM. What did I want to do with my private cloud? Well, I wanted to listen to some tunes with the Sonos system. I wanted to watch TV on my own time with a PVR. I wanted to share some webcam video feeds. I wanted to automatically get my vacation photos copied from this gadget to that home server while I'm still on vacation, which is no big deal now if you're using the public cloud, but it's a little bit trickier with private cloud. I also am enough of a geek working at a place like Splunk that I wanted to be able to Splunk and directly observe the weather as it comes in. So here's on my roof deck the weather station that you can go to. I'll share with you the URL to see the live data. I know that some of you are already quite experienced with Docker and the ecosystem. And of course, we got demos this morning with the keynote speakers showing how that company has set up all of these features for the enterprise product. But for those of us who are building things at home, whether they're robots or something less, you have to start out with a principal core. So this slide, grab a copy of these slides after the conference. This is my advice on how to get something up and running if you don't have all of those bells and whistles that come with enterprise software capabilities. This is actually kind of what I'm doing with my current project at Splunk now, trying to come up with this automated way of getting these services set up for my team there. So I started out with Docker Swarm 17.03, I think it was. I then defined the stacks with Docker Compose version 3, which had some of the Kubernetes capabilities, but it's a limited set. But I had gone as far as I could with those when I set these core services up. First, I used the registry free service, or free image that you can get from DockerHub. And then later on, I looked at Artifactory. Their version doesn't support Docker Registry in the free version, but Nexus does. So you can actually use Nexus as a pretty decent free Docker Registry for home-built setups. I also needed a way to synchronize my configuration files. So in my early days, 2 years ago, what I did was I set up a container with a copy of Git in it and set it up to just simply poll every 60 seconds. Is there a new version available from my admin directory? And under each of the subdirectories of that repo, it had etc files for my various services like the email or the backup software or the database. The three primary core services that you need on a cluster, if you're building one, are a database that's high availability, a file server that's high availability, which is actually trickier than it should be these days. In the commercial world, you can go out and get a network appliance, or in the cloud world, you can use the various file services. But for home setups, you're kind of stuck with Samba or NFS, which are not particularly high availability. These are tools that were written a long time ago. And even if you set them up on Docker, the persistent data model doesn't really work easily. So I'll go into that if I have time on how I resolved that. At the time, 2 years ago, we had something called Crash Plan for Home, which has been withdrawn from the market. And in this talk, I'll share the solution that I came up with. For security, because I don't want people to hack in, and if you look at the browser top bar, you'll see that I have a lot of services that are facing the internet. They're on the open Wi-Fi here in the conference. I don't think you guys can hack in, but I'm not challenging you to do so. The way that I protect a lot of them is with this other French guy that I've run into has published a really useful tool that I'll pitch called Authelia. If you're not familiar with that, take a look. It works with Google Authenticator just like a commercial VPN. And I also have a local LDAP server and Active Directory server. So you need some sort of a way of authenticating and protecting your external-facing services. Finally, the monitoring. I work for Splunk, but I'm really more familiar with Nagios and syslog raw files. So I have both passive monitoring of Splunk and active monitoring with Nagios. The importance of that is that you can look at that as kind of your live unit testing. If you ever fail to restart something that's critical on your setup, or if you push out an image that isn't working correctly, Nagios will catch a lot of those mistakes. Or if you get sophisticated with Splunk dashboards, you can do it that way. There's a dynamic DNS. How is it finding ci.net from here at the Moscone Center? It's using ECIP update with my DNS provider. Actually, it doesn't change very often. I could probably just hand edit the file if I wanted to. The way that I solved the problem of the lack of a high availability file server was to use a tool called Unison that essentially works like a rsync that copies files in both directions. Whichever one is the most recent wins. And that has been more reliable than any of the other systems that I've tried for clustered file systems. How to have fun with services. Well, you start out with the kinds of things that we DevOps folks actually think is fun. At least some of us do. We love Jenkins. More recently, GitLab has jumped into that fray. There's probably 18 other companies that produce CI/CD tools, but the ones that I use on my home setup are Jenkins and GitLab CI. Artifactory and Nexus, I have both of them set up. I have a WordPress service. I have party invitations manager called Davite. I'm actually using my setup to write my own, so stay tuned. I will roll out a new way of handling events, a little bit like Meetup, but with my own concepts of how to protect and manage the data. Email, I don't have to go into all that other than to point out that you need a lot of spam control capabilities if you're trying to run your own email server. I'm probably the last surviving person at the conference that runs their own email server. For media, I have MythTV and a Firefly media server called mt.d that is from the old iTunes ecosystem. The weather station runs a tool called WeWX. I did a little bit of my own customization in Python of that. And one of my more popular public images that I didn't expect to be so popular is something that monitors those little APC UPSs that you have to stick behind all these things. And that's actually, my image is actually being used in some commercial environments. All right, so DockerHub. Joined it 2 years ago, February. I posted my images into a mono repo. This is the URL. I chose a mono repo, even though at work we were using separate repos per microservice, so that it would be easier to handle the issues and keep track. And I think that's been a reasonable choice. Love to hear feedback on that. On DockerHub, there is a service for triggering builds automatically when you push to GitHub. That has been really useful, more useful since they overhauled the system a few months ago. And I had a handful of those popularity stars come in. But back in 2017, Swarm was not quite fully baked, and I kept having instability problems. And nobody wants to have their hobby prevent you from going out on the weekend because your email server just fell over. So in working with the community, I wanted to provide good README files. If you're going to leverage the community that Docker has built around itself, encourage people to contribute. Write up a contributing document. Decide which license applies to you. People will steal your stuff and make a lot of money on it, and some people are okay with that and some aren't. I happen to have in my own past a famous housemate, Richard Stallman, who, at the time that we lived together, were debating this because he was attempting to sue a company for stealing what he thought was his property, and so that was the birth of the GNU public license. That was kind of exciting times back then, and it's still relevant today. GitHub has its own built-in issue tracker. The counsel that I have for you is pay attention to feedback. So once I got all that set up, then the earth moved. I had gotten really comfortable with Docker Compose format. It's much easier to use, and I actually had in my notes, Kubernetes is too hard. It'll never go anywhere. That's what I told myself 3 years ago. But Kubernetes also has something that Docker Inc. doesn't have. I heard the number this morning, 450 headcount at Docker Inc. Google has a few more people. So I think that's why Kubernetes has taken off and taken over the planet the way that it has. It's still a little bit hard to use. Docker itself began its own journey with it in October of a year and a half ago and has made improvements to the Kubernetes experience. But at work, my own team hadn't yet started either with Swarm or with Kubernetes. I see one of my coworkers in the audience right now. He was one of the first to use Kubernetes at work. So the journey for us started really just in the last half year or so. In November, I built a new set of virtual machines on my hosts and enrolled in the Linux Foundation course. Look that up online. It's called Kubernetes Administrator Certification. And I didn't get the certification, but I went through a lot of the course and helped me figure things out. It only took me 2 months, and I was then able to cut over to bare metal Kubernetes on the same machines. It was shaky for a few weeks, but at this point, I've stabilized everything well enough to get in front of you guys and on my own Kubernetes cluster present this slide deck. The main benefit of Kubernetes that I have used since cutting over from Swarm is that I no longer have to have that git pull every minute. When I edit a file and commit it to the repo, the config file will trigger a restart of the containers that depend on those etc file configs. Also, with the Kubernetes ecosystem having grown so much, and with Docker itself building its community, there's now so many people who can help you if you get your work out there. So that's my slide deck, and I have a couple of closing thoughts afterward, but let me show you a few of the services that I have up and running. This is my weather station, which builds these graphs in real time. I started it out on a Raspberry Pi and cut it over first to Docker, and now it's running on my Kubernetes cluster. It's got 3 microservices, one of which is the Python code that polls the weather station, another of which is a rsync container that has an Nginx server that presents the content to you here. And another piece is the Weather Underground camera, so that you can see, if the demo gods are kind to me, I will be able to see the live picture from my house. That's facing to the west, away from here. And then if I change the URL, I'll see in this direction facing the Moscone Center. So that's what I see when I go home tonight. The Jenkins server, I built a pipeline for each of the services that I want to maintain myself. My email server, I use something called Rain Loop. This is what the UI looks like. I can probably find one of the DockerCon messages. Another of the messages reminding us of events here. My invitations manager that I invite people to Thanksgiving looks like this, very old school. This was one of the lift and shift kinds of applications where I took the old Perl script that I've been running on bare metal, moved it into a Docker container. That's published online, and I'm in the middle of replacing it. My own Splunk server I don't have time in this talk to go into what you can see with it, and I'm not here to pitch Splunk, but go buy some Splunk. I'm not sure. Does anybody else run their own Jira server at home? No? No? I don't see any hands. Oh, there. Yeah, there's like 2 in the back. I actually find it useful because whenever you have a hobby like this, there are 100 things that run through your head all the time. And I also get insomnia a lot. So if I have these things running through my head in the middle of the night, I can't go back to sleep. But what Jira does is let me sleep by taking a note, putting it into my project, and filing it away so I can reprioritize it later. I have a really old WordPress site that still works, and it's now Dockerized, Kubernetes-ized. This is a glance at the tool that I use for uploading images. If you look online, you'll find Nextcloud is a full-featured photo sync capability. It also will synchronize calendar entries and so forth. So it's got a lot of the features of iCloud. Duplicati is the backup tool that replaced the Crash Plan for Home. It's a little bit shaky, and it's a Windows mono application, but it also works well enough on Linux and Docker that I was able to present it here. One of the kind of cool tools for a personal VPN is called Guacamole. And this screen shows me being able to look at my tax return, for example. With Windows, I'm not running Docker Windows yet, at least. Maybe I could. So this is actually a Windows VM that I'm connecting to using remote desktop. But remote desktop doesn't really work very well from, say, a conference Wi-Fi. So Guacamole provides a way of making Windows applications visible through a URL like what you see at the top of the screen. It's just HTTPS, I call it desktop under my domain. And with that, I'm going to go back to my slide and close out. My closing thoughts are, in your README files, I'll show you a couple of those. Use badges to make the content come alive. These are the kinds of things I'm talking about. So whenever the DockerHub build kicks off, it will create a new image. It will create a new tag. And having those versions and image sizes there and visible will keep you on your toes, make sure that your images are kept efficient and small. All of my Docker files I put out there as an example of best practices for making Docker run efficiently. Make each small, make them independent of each other. I don't do a lot of layers. It just makes it harder to follow the logic. Security, as you've heard from all the other speakers, is improved by making your upgrades faster and easier. Have fun. Get those issues in from your users. You'll see pull requests, and those are my favorite. And thanks for coming and listening.
Awesome. Yeah, let's give it up for Rich. Thanks so much, Rich. Do we have I know it's just about time for lunch, but we do have time for a couple more questions if anybody has them. Any questions for Rich? Yes.
Did you say you were using Nextcloud?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. Did you start out with OwnCloud? Or did you go straight to Nextcloud?
I tried OwnCloud before this project about 3 years ago. And by the time I started this journey 2 years ago, Nextcloud had surpassed OwnCloud. Mm-hmm. So apparently a lot of the early developers of the OwnCloud project defected and moved on to Nextcloud. Mm-hmm. One of the things that OwnCloud does better, though, is the iPhone app is a little bit ahead. But one of the other things that I encourage people to do, if you're publishing your own open source, also contribute at least bug reports to the developers of things like that that you care about. So I've actually been able to get both Duplicati and Nextcloud iOS apps improved.
Oh, cool. So do you just mainly just use it for photo sharing, or do you use it for other purposes?
Well, one of the cool things is that I can put my airline reservation info into the iPhone calendar and share it with the household, and that way other household members know what my travel plans are.
Oh, okay. So use the calendar side of it
Yeah.
too, but not too much with the file sync.
I think the file sync in the docs is a little bit more. The OpenX docs allows me to go in and edit things directly. So I've been using that myself more. But the file share capability of Nextcloud is really useful if you want to mount the volumes remotely.
Okay, thanks.
Awesome. Any other questions? Yeah, got another one up here.
What do you use for mail backend?
The email backend. If you look in my DockerHub, well, you have to in order to see it. At the top of the list, I have the list of images, and here is the collection of images that I published for email. And what I use are a slightly modified postfix. In fact, I didn't find a good, well-built postfix container, so that's why I published my own. Along with Spam Assassin, there's a kind of a cool little thing called Blacklist that I feed a custom Python script. Take whatever email addresses that I've found that I no longer use those as honeypot. And what that blacklist tool does is create my own way of, if I ever get any message on this honeypot address, then I know not to let mail from that same source come through to my main address.
Awesome. Any other questions?
And the source of that is all there in this repo.
Yeah.
How do you get started with the badges and the README there?
All right, the badges, you can look at the back end of these pages. Go to my homepage, look at the this README file, and you'll see the links. There's a site called microbadger.com, which fell a little bit behind in its ability to keep up with some of the so-called image layers logic. I wanted to be able to run this kind of thing in the data center at work, but they were able to keep this up and running as a public service. So if you go to Microbadger, get an API key, and link that into DockerHub, it will automatically update these badges for you.
Awesome. Any other questions for Rich? All right. Thanks so much, Rich. Any last thoughts from you before we?
It's an exciting day for me because I have jury duty, which I have to go to this afternoon, and they have not Dockerized the jury system. So if any of you are looking for civic projects to improve the life of people in this country, think about ways of improving how governments operate.
Well, I'm glad that the timing worked out and we were able to have you here. Thanks so much for coming, Rich. Let's give it up one more time. Rich Braun, everybody.